Up next in the broadcast, negotiations for the Korea-Canada Free Trade Agreement are now complete. Once passed by both governments, it will be Canada's first FTA with an Asian nation. Korea and Japan will sit down for the first vice ministerial level talks in months, but Seoul says that it's firm in its stance that it's not due to warming ties. On this third anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, lawmakers in Korea urge the public to reduce reliance on nuclear energy as a lesson from the tragedy. Primetime News begins now.
Good evening to our viewers in Korea and hello to those of you who are watching from around the world. It's Tuesday, March 11th here in Seoul. I'm Ji-hae.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thank you so much for joining us. We begin this evening with some good news on a long-stalled bilateral free trade deal.
Following their second summit talks in less than 6 months, President Park Geun-hye and visiting Canadian Prime Minister Harper have come to an agreement on an FTA. Our presidential office correspondent Choi You-sun has our top story.
Korea's comprehensive trade pact with its 25th trading partner goes beyond goods and services to include investments, finance, and intellectual property.
이번 FTA 협상 타결은 양국 간의 통상과 투자를 포함해서 호혜적인 협력을 더욱 확대하기 위한 제도적 기반을 마련할 것이라는 점에서 매우 의의가 크다고 생각합니다.
It will create jobs and opportunities for Canadians today and, just as importantly, for the generations that follow.
Over the next 10 years, each side will lift tariffs on nearly 98% of goods. For Korean automakers whose products make up almost half of the nation's $10 billion annual exports to Canada, the 6% tariff barrier will be removed in 2 years. This means Korean companies like Hyundai and Kia, which currently make up 12% of the Canadian market, will be able to make further inroads in the North American country. While more than 200 farm products, including rice, are exempt from the deal, relatively high tariffs of up to 40% on Korean beef and pork will be partially lifted over the next 5 to 15 years. To allay concerns among Korean livestock farmers worried about the impact of trade deals with both Canada and Australia, Seoul says it's working on measures to assist them. Canada is now Korea's 12th FTA partner. After the deal is signed and approved by the parliaments of each country, it is expected to go into effect next year. Stressing that bilateral security cooperation is as important as economic issues, Prime Minister Harper expressed support for President Park's trust-building policies towards North Korea. The two leaders then urged Pyongyang to completely and verifiably rid itself of all its nuclear arms. Choi You-sun, Arirang News.
And speaking of FTAs, Korea is also making headway on another free trade pact, this one with Vietnam.
A fourth round of free trade talks between Korea and Vietnam kicks off on Wednesday in Ho Chi Minh City. The two sides are expected to hold discussions on various areas, including products, service, and investment. The talks are scheduled to run through this Friday. Negotiations for the bilateral FTA were launched in September 2012. Vietnam is Korea's second largest trading partner among ASEAN nations. The vice foreign ministers of Korea and Japan will meet for talks in Seoul on Wednesday on security and bilateral issues for the first time in 8 months.
But our Hwang Sung-hee says no one is holding out much hope for the dialogue.
Amid souring ties between South Korea and Japan, Japanese Vice Foreign Minister Akitaka Saiki will arrive in Seoul Wednesday for talks with his South Korean counterpart, Jo Tae-yong. Wednesday's talks will be the first vice ministerial-level meeting between the two neighboring countries in 8 months. But Seoul's foreign ministry says it's not a sign of thawing ties.
The South Korean government repeated several times what steps Japan must take for progress in Korea-Japan ties.
Japan has yet to officially apologize for its wartime sexual enslavement of roughly 200,000 women in the early 20th century. In an interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun Tuesday, Chinese ambassador to Japan, Chang Yong-hwa, called out Tokyo for its lack of responsibility over historical issues. Speaking about why the annual trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan did not take place last year, the Chinese diplomat blamed Japan and said he does not see such a meeting happening in the near future. But U.S. President Barack Obama will try to mediate when he visits Seoul and Tokyo for summit talks in April. Washington wants its two allies to put history behind them, concerned the intensifying friction will affect their trilateral alliance. Ahead of President Obama's trip, the three leaders will meet at the end of this month in The Hague for the Nuclear Security Summit. Some point to the possibility of a trilateral summit, but the chances of the two neighbors shaking hands are slim. South Korean President Park Geun-hye has made it perfectly clear that she will not sit down with a leader who fails to acknowledge his country's historical wrongdoings. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
The Korea scandal-ridden spy agency is under fire again. The prosecutors raided the headquarters of the National Intelligence Service late Monday over suspicions it fabricated evidence in an espionage case. Ji-hae reports.
The nation's spy agency is staring down the barrel of another scandal. Prosecutors on Tuesday are digging into documents seized during a 7-hour raid of the National Intelligence Service overnight. The NIS, already a target of public criticism for meddling in the 2012 presidential election, is suspected of tampering with documents to support its charge that a Seoul city government official is a North Korean spy. The suspicions have gained traction in recent days after an NIS informant claimed he had yet to receive money he was promised for faking the documents. The prosecution's raid came hours after President Park Geun-hye ordered a thorough investigation into the case. This is the second time the prosecution has raided the spy agency since President Park came into office more than a year ago. In April last year, prosecutors looked into allegations that the National Intelligence Service's former chief ordering agents to drum up support online for then-candidate Park in the 2012 election. Late last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring an overhaul of the spy agency and banning it from participating in domestic politics. The back-to-back scandals are fueling the public's distrust of the NIS, with opposition politicians calling for the resignation of NIS chief Nam Jae-jun. Depending on the investigation outcome, NIS agents involved in the scandal could be charged with breaching the national security law for the first time ever in history. Yurian, Arirang News.
Phase 2 of a massive medical strike has started here in Korea. This comes after tens of thousands of doctors walked off the job on Monday. For the next week and a half or so, doctors taking part in the strike will cut their work hours and limit time spent with patients. Our Kwon So-hwa has the details.
The medical strike has just begun. After Monday's walkout, the Korean Medical Association is progressing to the next round of its strike as planned. While those taking part in Monday's strike refused to provide any medical services, starting Tuesday through March 23rd, doctors will turn to a work-to-rule action. This means they won't work more than 40 hours a week, which is around 10 hours fewer than usual, and will treat patients for no longer than 15 minutes. A full 6-day strike is then planned to begin on March 24th, which could also include the closing of emergency rooms and intensive care centers. If residents and interns participate in the 2-week strike too, there are concerns this will affect the public, considering they work up to 100 hours a week. Although some patients were inconvenienced by Monday's walkout, it didn't create as much chaos as initially feared. The government has reiterated it will react strongly to illegal actions that put the health of the public at risk. The health ministry estimates around 29% of doctors at hospitals and local clinics took part in Monday's walkout, while the Medical Association puts the figure at 49%. As big as that discrepancy are the stark differences in opinion over the government's health reform plans, which prompted the KMA strike. KMA doctors are against government plans to introduce a telemedicine system that would allow for patients in remote areas to be diagnosed and treated via webcam, smartphone, or even email, saying this will impair the quality of medical services. The KMA is also up in arms over the government's move to run for-profit subsidiaries. Some doctors are worried the reforms could eventually lead to privatization of the medical sector. The Medical Association says it expects even more doctors to take part in the second round of strikes. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
It has been 3 years since the meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant in Japan, and the effects of the crisis are still being felt.
To raise awareness of the lessons from the deadly disaster, lawmakers in Korea held an event in Parliament. Our National Assembly correspondent Ji Myung-gil was there.
Lawmakers at the National Assembly urged the government to reduce the country's reliance on nuclear power as its main source of electricity at an event Tuesday held in remembrance of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The lawmakers advised the public not to forget the lessons of the incident in Japan and to consider the implications for Korea. One lawmaker reported on her 3-day visit to radiation-exposed sites around Fukushima.
After 3 years, most of the contaminated areas stand in neglect, and people are still suffering. The Japanese government says the Fukushima disaster is mostly under control. There is a big problem with remarks like that and the Korean government's plans to build more nuclear power plants.
Han Myung-suk, who leads the Parliamentary Sustainable Development Committee, lashed out at the Japanese government for restarting the country's nuclear reactors.
The Japanese people, and especially children, are still suffering 3 years after the crisis. The Abe administration has broken its promise of denuclearization, and I believe the government is out of its mind to restart the nuclear power plants. Abe is sure to be disregarded by his people.
Meanwhile, the government is trying to use more renewable energy resources. The National Assembly has its own solar panels, which generate roughly 165 kilowatts of electricity per year. The panels are capable of reducing carbon dioxide levels by some 87 tons per year. Last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring that 10% of the electricity in all new buildings in Seoul that are more than 100 square meters come from renewable energy resources. The bill also requires that more than 50% of the lights in the buildings have LED bulbs. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
With politics and opinions surrounding the Fukushima incident far from settled, we delve into the extent of the repercussions and lessons to be learned for the nuclear power industry in Korea.
To help us do just that, we're joined by Dr. Park Geun-hye, Professor of Nuclear Engineering at Seoul National University. Thanks for joining us again.
Pleasure to be here again.
Dr. Seo, it's been 3 years since the nuclear accident, and yet there are continued reports on Japan's insufficient crisis management. What are they doing so wrong?
Actually, they're not doing really something meaningful or essential other than Mother Nature. Mother Nature has taken care of those uranium material core because it's being cooled by now, but they should have done something more drastic, like probably they should have put these reactors in sarcophagus or stone coffin, exactly like Chernobyl did.
So what are some of the possible fallouts from this continued poor oversight, and how will we be affected, especially here in Korea?
Korea, actually, I don't think any disaster or any catastrophe taking place in Fukushima might be reaching our East Coast or West Coast, even South Coast. I don't think so. But things that they are actually make an impact on the public awareness and acceptance and actually concern over nuclear power safety. I think that's the major concern as far as we are concerned. Nobody can make sure that this kind of incident might not be taking place in the Korean peninsula. So that's the hard part as far as I'm concerned.
What could be the exceptions then?
Exceptions like what?
You've just dismissed scientists' prediction that low-level radiation could reach any part of South Korea. So.
Yes, actually, I don't think those circulation water or ocean flow is not going to affect us because from that point of view, Korea is at the best spot because we're far from, actually, the U.S., Canada, Mexico are in worse shape because of all this ocean current movements and also westerly wind. So we're actually right at their back, don't worry. But thing is that sometimes, think about the huge container vessel, they might be carrying what they call ballast water. It's like a balancing water, maybe 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 tons of water that should be filled in. So if they take water from anywhere near Fukushima, which is a possibility, more than a possibility, then they can be bringing it over right to Busan or somewhere else, Incheon. And it doesn't take too long, maybe a couple of days at the most. So that means we might be susceptible to those hot spots. That's probably what we have to be really concerned about rather than ocean current or westerly wind.
Well, in the wake of a corruption scandals involving the nuclear power industry last year, and the government has rolled out measures to prevent irregularities from happening again. Do you think they're enough?
That's good enough, but again, there's something missing there because they're talking about, basically strengthening the oversight and actually increasing the breakwater, like 2 kilometers, 2 meters thick, 10 meters high. But if it comes to safety, it's not just hardware. It has to be more with manpower, humanware. If you take a look at the manpower on sites, it's about half of Canada or even the US. So that means we have to be putting in some more manpower to the sites than just investing in the hardware. So I think that's the missing part. If it's done, then we must be in a much, much better shape than we are in.
All right, Professor Seo, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Pleasure.
And moving now to some of the top stories on the global front, from the expanded search for that missing Malaysian airliner to the upcoming anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing, we go over now to Paulie at the News Center.
So, Paul, after 4 days of searching, it looks like there's been a breakthrough in the search for that Malaysian airliner. What can you tell us?
Well, Malaysian military has reportedly tracked the missing jetliner by radar over the Malacca Strait. Now the location is quite far from where it last made radio contact with air traffic controllers off the country's east coast. The Boeing 777 apparently vanished 1 hour after taking off from Kuala Lumpur for Beijing on Saturday. Since then, there has been no confirmed traces of the aircraft or the 239 people on board. A military official close to the investigation told Reuters that the plane had suddenly changed course, taking a lower altitude, and then made its way to the Malacca Strait.
Now, what about the 2 passengers who boarded the plane with stolen passports? Has there been any updates on that front?
Yes. Interpol's Secretary General Ronald Noble said Tuesday that they have identified both men who used stolen Austrian and Italian passports to board the missing plane. Noble said the 2 young men entered Malaysia using valid Iranian passports. He said 18-year-old Pura Noor Mohammadi and 29-year-old Delavar Saeed Mohammed Raza were likely trying to migrate to Germany. Interpol said it was unlikely that they were part of a terrorist group. Malaysian police earlier said they had not ruled out the possibility of hijacking, sabotage, or mechanical failure. Ukraine's government has asked the Council of Europe to investigate the clashes that led up to the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. Crimea is set to hold a referendum on Sunday to decide whether to establish closer ties with Moscow or join the Russian Federation altogether. During talks in Kiev Monday, Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said any results from the referendum would be illegitimate.
I'm absolutely certain that this referendum could be recognized by North Korea and probably Syria, and that's it. We are appealing to the Russian Federation to immediately cancel the referendum.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has rejected an offer to hold talks on the crisis with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kerry said any negotiations would be extremely difficult in the face of Moscow's military intervention in the country.
All right, Paul, let's now head over to the United States. It's been nearly a year since the deadly Boston Marathon bombings that killed 3 people, but it doesn't seem like it slowed down the American city from pushing ahead with the iconic race.
That's right. Local and federal authorities held a news briefing Monday outlining enhanced security measures for the 118th Boston Marathon, which will take place this year on April 21st. More than 3,500 officers will be deployed to cover the 42-kilometer course, while public security screenings will also be expanded. The Boston Athletics Association says that more than 36,000 runners are set to compete next month, which is 9,000 more than last year. At least 1 million spectators are expected to attend. Back to you guys.
All right, thanks, Paul, for that report. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Hello and welcome to Primetime Sports. I'm Stephen Che. South Korean golfer Park Geun-hye retained her spot as the world's #1 ladies golfer for the 48th week in a row, bolstered by her win at the World Ladies Championship over the weekend. With the victory, Park raised her average points total to 10.28, extending her lead over the world #2 Suzanne Pettersen by 0.92 points. Now, there wasn't much movement in the rankings, with Stacey Lewis, Lydia Ko, and fellow Korean Yoo So-yeon rounding out the top 5. Meanwhile, the Sports Ministry on Tuesday awarded Park the Meng-ho Medal, which recognizes athletes that go above and beyond in their sport. And moving on, the Sochi Olympics was one of the biggest in history, and the follow-up, the Paralympics Winter Games, is also breaking records. Just days after opening, a staggering 287,000 tickets were sold. That's 57,000 more than the previous record set at the 2010 Vancouver Games. The International Paralympic Committee website was also flooded with visitors, seeing an 85% increase in traffic compared to 4 years ago. And heading to the NBA hardcourt, the Miami Heat clinched a spot in the playoffs after defeating the Washington Wizards at home on Monday night. The defending champs beat the visitors 99-90 to end the 3-game skid on the back of a 23-point performance by LeBron James and 22 by his co-star Dwayne Wade. Now the Heat follow the Indiana Pacers, who clinched their postseason berth last week. And over to the majors. All-time home run king Barry Bonds has donned the San Francisco Giant uniform for the first time in nearly 7 years. The 49-year-old Bonds is at spring training with the Giants, not to hit homers, but as a special hitting coach. He'll be passing on some of his hitting knowledge to the players during his 1 week with the team. Now let's go on over to Korean Pro Volleyball in the V-League. Korean Air took on LIG Insurance. Now, Korean Air has already earned their playoff spot, while LIG plays out their last season matchup. Michael Sanchez shows good form, giving Korean Air the early 2-set lead. LIG won't let up easily, but they're clearly outmatched, and Korean Air wins 3-0. Now that's all I have for now. This has been Stephen Che. I'll see you back here later for more from the world of sports.
I understand that there's some good news for those who've been waiting for the dry conditions to end.
Right, for more, let's connect live to our Kim Boo-kyung at the Weather Center. Boo-kyung, fill us in.
Good evening. Well, afternoon highs rose all the way to the low to mid-teens here in Korea on Tuesday. However, dry weather advisories are still in effect throughout the country, and in some regions where dry weather alerts have been issued, humidity levels have dipped to the low teens, so be careful not to start any forest fires. While relief is in sight, clouds will gradually move in, leading to nationwide rain tomorrow. The mountains of Jeju may get more than 80 millimeters of precipitation, and most parts of the country will see between 5 to 30 millimeters, and less than 5 millimeters is forecast for Seoul, so make sure to have an umbrella handy. Taking a look at the current conditions, the nation is under the influence of a high-pressure system from the south, which is why we're seeing clear skies across the map. Now tomorrow, make sure to dress accordingly, as a 10-degree gap in temperatures between the day and night will continue. Other than that, 3 to 8 centimeters of snow could fall on the mountains of Gangwon-do province. Taking a look at Wednesday's readings, Seoul starts off the day at 3 degrees with a high of 11, and cities down south make it to the low to mid-teens. Moving on to other regions, Daejeon and Dokdo peaks at 11, and Mount Kumgang tops out at 3. That's all for now, but I'll be back with more after midnight.
Thanks, Po-kyung. And that's our broadcast on this Tuesday night. I'm Ji-hae in Seoul.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.